The millionaire saw the woman in the square and discovered that she was the true heir to his fortune. The sound of the heart monitor was the only sound in the bedroom of the luxurious mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. Richard Sterling, one of Wall Street's biggest investors, watched as his mentor and adoptive father, Maxwell Harrison, struggled to breathe in his final moments. At 82, Maxwell had built a financial empire from scratch, but now, his last words were about to destroy everything Richard believed he knew about his own life. "Richard," Maxwell whispered, his weak voice barely audible in the silent room, "there's something I need to tell you before I go. Something I've carried with me for decades." Richard leaned closer, holding the wrinkled hand of the man who had raised him since he was 12. "What is it, Dad?" "You," Maxwell coughed, struggling to form the words. "You're not the only heir. There's someone else. Someone who has as much right to the Harrison fortune as you do." Richard's world stopped. For 30 years, since Maxwell had adopted him following the death of his biological parents in a car accident, he had been the only son, the sole heir to the Harrison empire. The revelation hit him like a punch in the gut. "What are you talking about?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "Who?" "Catherine," Maxwell whispered. "My biological granddaughter. James' daughter." James, the name that was never mentioned in the Harrison mansion. Maxwell's biological son who had disappeared 25 years ago after a devastating fight with his father. Richard knew only fragments of this story. Something about James rejecting the family empire to pursue his own life. "Is she alive?" Richard asked, his heart racing. "Where?" Maxwell squeezed Richard's hand with surprising strength. "Boston, but I don't know where exactly. James died 15 years ago, in an accident. I never heard from his granddaughter until I received a letter last year. I tried to find her, but," his voice faltered, "why didn't you tell me before?" "Pride? Shame." Maxwell took a deep breath. "Afraid of losing you too. But she deserves to know the truth. She deserves her share. Promise me you'll find her, Richard. Promise me you'll do the right thing." Richard felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. "I promise, Dad. I'll find her." Maxwell smiled slightly, his blue eyes twinkling one last time. "The envelope, in the bureau drawer. Everything I know about her is there." His breathing became shallower. "Do the right thing, son." Those were his last words. 3 days later, while New York's high society gathered for Maxwell Harrison's funeral, Richard locked himself in the mansion study. The yellowed envelope was exactly where Maxwell had said it would be, hidden under decades of important documents. Inside, he found a crumpled letter, dated the previous year. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. It was from a social worker in Boston, explaining that Catherine Morrison, Maxwell's granddaughter, was looking for her biological family. There was also an old photo, showing a baby in the arms of James Harrison, the rebellious son Richard had never met. Richard spent hours studying the documents, trying to process how his life had changed so drastically. As CEO of Harrison Investments, he ran a $4.2 billion empire. The idea of sharing this with a stranger? No, his niece by adoption, was surreal. But a promise was a promise. The next morning, Richard canceled all his meetings and flew to Boston in his private jet. The only clue he had was an old address in the Dorchester neighborhood, in the name Catherine Morrison. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The streets of Dorchester were a different world from the mansion in Greenwich. Old red brick buildings lined the narrow sidewalks, and children played ball in the street. Richard, in his tailored Italian suit, felt completely out of place. The address led him to a small cafe on the corner of Dorchester Avenue. "The Morning Brew," proclaimed the worn sign. Richard entered, the bell on the door announcing his arrival. "Welcome to the Morning Brew." A cheerful voice greeted him. Richard froze. The woman behind the counter had the same piercing blue eyes as Maxwell Harrison. Her brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her apron was stained with coffee. But there was no doubt. He was looking at the same face from the baby photo, 25 years later. "Catherine Morrison?" he asked, his voice huskier than he had intended. The woman frowned in surprise. "Yes? Can I help you?" Richard straightened his tie, suddenly nervous. How could he explain that he was her uncle by adoption, that she was heir to billions? that his whole life was about to change? "My name is Richard Sterling Harrison," he began, watching the understanding slowly dawn in her eyes. "And I think we need to talk about your grandfather, Maxwell Harrison." The glass Catherine was holding slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. The noise echoed through the silent cafe, marking the moment when two lives, separated by decades of family secrets, finally connected. Catherine Morrison stared at the shards of porcelain scattered across the cafe floor, her world spinning in slow motion. The name Harrison echoed in her mind like a distant bell. For years, she had searched for any connection to her paternal family, and now, on an ordinary Tuesday in April, the past had literally walked through her door. "Lucy, can you take over the counter for a moment?" She called out to her employee, who was watching the scene from the kitchen with curiosity. Turning to Richard, Catherine gestured towards a table at the back of the cafe, away from the few morning customers. The elegant man in front of her seemed out of place among the rustic wooden tables and the walls decorated with local art. Catherine noticed that he had the same aristocratic bearing as the old photographs her mother had kept of her father, James Harrison. "So," she began, her hands interlaced on the table to disguise her trembling, Your uncle? By adoption?" Richard added, his tone softening. "Maxwell adopted me after I lost my parents. I was 12 at the time." Catherine nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "I looked for you, a year ago, when I finally plucked up the courage. The social worker said she'd sent a letter, but I never got a reply." Richard lowered his eyes, guilt evident on his face. "Maxwell, your grandfather? He hid the letter. He only told me about you on his deathbed 3 days ago." The impact of the news hit Catherine like a wave. "He's dead?" Her voice faltered. The grandfather she had never met, the last link to her father, was gone before she could get to know him. "I'm sorry," Richard offered gently. He was sorry too. In his last moments, he made me promise to find her, to make things right. Catherine stood up abruptly, walking over to the cafe window. Outside, Dorchester continued her normal routine, oblivious to the emotional earthquake taking place inside the Morning Brew. This cafe was her refuge, built with years of savings and hard work, following in the footsteps of her mother, Rachel, who had raised her alone after James' death. "My mother always said that Dad was different from his family," Catherine said, still with her back to Richard, "that he chose love over money. But after he died in that car accident, when I was 10, it was as if all connection with the Harrisons had died with him." Richard observed Catherine's tense back, noticing how much she resembled James in the few photos he had seen of him. "Maxwell never got over James' departure. He built walls around his heart, buried himself in work. I've seen it happen over the years." Catherine turned to him, her blue eyes, the Harrisons' eyes, shining with restrained tears. "And now? Why are you here, Richard?" "Because you're a Harrison," he replied simply. "And as such, you're heir to half of Maxwell's fortune, approximately $2 billion. The number hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Catherine let out a nervous, hysterical laugh. $2 billion? That's... She shook her head in disbelief. "I can barely pay the rent on this cafe for a few months." "The will be read next week," Richard continued, keeping his voice calm. "But before that, I'd like you to get to know your inheritance. Not just the money, but your family history, the people who worked with your father, the places he loved." Catherine sat back down, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Why are you doing this? You could just not have come to me." Richard took out of his pocket the old photo he'd found in the envelope, James holding baby Catherine. "Because I promised Maxwell, and because, looking at you now, I can see that he was right. You deserve to know who you are, Catherine. You deserve to know your story." The doorbell rang, announcing new customers. Lucy cast a questioning glance at Catherine, who made a reassuring gesture with her hand. "I've got a coffee to run," she said, wiping her hand across her face to wipe away tears she hadn't even realized she'd shed. "I can't just come with me to Greenwich," Richard interrupted. "Just for a few days. I can get someone to look after the cafe. Let me show you the house where your father grew up, the places that were part of his history." Catherine looked around her little cafe, the walls she had personally painted, the tables she had picked out one by one. This was her world, small but hers, and now, a whole universe was opening up before her, full of untold stories and lost family ties. When? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My jet is at Logan International. We can leave as soon as you're ready. Catherine nodded slowly, a decision crystallizing in her heart. Give me an hour. I need to make some calls and pack a bag. When Richard left the cafe to make his own calls, Catherine remained seated, the photo of her father with her baby trembling in her hands. Somewhere in Greenwich, a mansion full of memories awaited her, along with a past she had never known and a future she had never imagined possible. The jet sliced through the New England skies as Catherine watched Boston disappear beneath the clouds. Next to her, an untouched glass of champagne condensed on the mahogany table. The luxury of the private aircraft, with its cream leather seats and gold details, seemed surreal after the simplicity of morning brew. Nervous? Richard asked, noticing how she was fastening her seatbelt. It's not every day you find out you're a billionaire, Catherine replied with a thin smile. Or that you fly in a private jet. Richard studied her profile against the window. In just a few hours, he had discovered that Catherine had inherited not only Maxwell's eyes, but also his determination. Even in the face of the shocking news, she had organized the cafe with impressive efficiency, delegating responsibilities and reassuring staff before leaving. There's something I need to show you, he said, reaching for his briefcase. I found this in Maxwell's office last night. Catherine took the aged envelope he offered. Inside was a bundle of letters, all returned to sender, all written by Maxwell Harrison, addressed to James Morrison. Has he tried to contact you? Catherine whispered, her fingers tracing the elegant handwriting. For years, Richard confirmed. After James left, Maxwell sent one letter a month. They all came back. His father had moved away, leaving behind any trace that might lead him back to the Harrison family. Catherine opened the first letter, dated 25 years ago. Maxwell's words were full of regret and pleading. Son, you were right. Money isn't everything. Please come home. Mom never mentioned the letters, Catherine murmured, leafing through the envelopes. She always said that Dad was happy with our simple life, that he never regretted leaving everything behind. And she was wrong? Catherine paused, recalling her childhood memories. No, he really was happy. At weekends, we'd picnic on Boston Common. He taught me how to make coffee. He said it was an art worth more than all the gold in the world. She smiled at the memory. On summer evenings, we'd sit on the porch and he'd tell stories. Sometimes he would mention a rose garden that his mother had cultivated. The garden still exists, Richard interrupted gently. Eleanor, his grandmother, planted it when she married Maxwell. After she passed away, he kept each rose exactly as she left it. The jet began its descent, and Greenwich appeared below them, a landscape of stately mansions and meticulously tended gardens. Catherine felt her heart race at the sight of one particularly grand estate, with a labyrinth of roses visible even from the height at which they stood. That's, Richard nodded. Welcome to Harrison Manor. The car waiting for them at the private airport was a black Rolls-Royce, with a uniformed chauffeur who opened the doors without a word. During the journey, Catherine watched the city go by out of the window, as different from Dorchester as possible, with its exclusive boutiques and fine restaurants. As they drove through the gates of the mansion, Catherine held her breath. The main house was a majestic building of stone and glass, with Greco-Roman columns and floor-to-ceiling windows. But her eyes were immediately drawn to the rose garden. May I? She asked as soon as the car stopped, opening the door. Richard followed her as she walked among the rose bushes, his hands gently touching the fragrant petals. Roses in every possible shade bloomed in precise patterns, creating a natural kaleidoscope of colors. Your father used to help Eleanor look after them, Richard commented. Maxwell told me that James knew the name of every variety. Catherine stopped in front of a particular rose bush, its flowers a deep, velvety red. Sterling's heart, she murmured. Richard looked at her, surprised. How do you know? Dad had a single rose bush at our house, she explained, tears streaming silently down her face. It was of this variety. He called it his mother's last gift. At that moment, a lady in her 60s appeared at the entrance to the mansion. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper, asked me to let you know that dinner will be served in an hour." "Thank you, Marian," Richard replied, then turned to Catherine. "Shall we? There's a lot more to see, and I imagine you'll want to rest a bit before dinner." Catherine nodded, but her eyes remained on the roses. Somewhere in this garden, she thought, was her family's history. In the flowers that her grandmother had planted, that her father had loved, that Maxwell had preserved. And now, she was here to discover every part of that story. As they walked up the marble steps of the main entrance, Catherine couldn't help but notice how the roses looked more vibrant in the evening light, as if they were welcoming Eleanor Harrison's long-lost granddaughter. Dinner at the Harrison mansion was served at precisely 7 o'clock, in a dining room larger than the entire morning brew. Catherine, after an invigorating bath in her suite, a room that could easily accommodate her entire apartment in Dorchester, found herself seated in front of a mahogany table that seemed to extend infinitely. Mrs. Reynolds, an elegant woman with impeccably groomed gray hair, was supervising the waiters as they served the first starter, an asparagus soup with truffles. "Mrs. Reynolds has been with the family for 40 years, Richard commented, noticing Catherine's curious look. "She knew your father very well." The housekeeper smiled gently. "James always stole cookies from the kitchen after dinner. Even in his 20s, he kept up this adorable habit." Catherine felt a lump in her throat. He kept doing it. At home, there was always a jar of cookies next to the coffee maker. He said that sweets and coffee were the perfect combination. "Like your mother," Mrs. Reynolds added softly. "Rachel, she worked here for a summer as a barista at the Harrison's Country Club. That's how she met James." Catherine put down her spoon in surprise. "Mom never mentioned that." "Ah, it was a real modern fairy tale," the housekeeper continued, her eyes sparkling with the memory. "James was overseeing the club's operations, his first independent project for Maxwell. Rachel made the best cappuccinos in Greenwich. He fell in love not just with her, but with the idea of building something of his own, away from the Harrison empire." Richard watched Catherine absorb every word, every new detail about her parents. "The club still exists," he mentioned. "We've kept a lot of the original decor, including the old coffee pot that Rachel used." "Can I see?" Catherine asked, her soup forgotten. "Tomorrow," Richard promised. "There's something else I need to show you tonight." After dinner, a 5-course event that left Catherine marveling at flavors she had never tasted before, Richard led her to Maxwell's office. The room was exactly as Catherine would have imagined a billionaire's office. Dark wood-paneled walls, floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with leather-bound books, and an imposing work desk in front of French windows. "This was Maxwell's sanctuary," Richard explained, walking over to a sideboard where several crystal bottles held different types of whiskey. But it was also where he kept his most precious memories. He opened a desk drawer and took out a brown leather photo album. "I found this last night. I think you should see it." Catherine sat down in one of the leather armchairs, the heavy album on her lap. On the first page, a wedding photo. Maxwell and Eleanor Harrison, young and smiley. On the following pages, the birth and growth of James. Moments frozen in time that told the story of a family that had once been happy. "Wait," Catherine whispered, stopping at a particular photo. It showed James as a teenager, sitting at the piano in the music room. "We had a piano at home. Small, nothing compared to this one. But the love of music was a Harrison tradition," Richard explained, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into crystal glasses. "Eleanor was a classical pianist before she married Maxwell. James inherited her talent." Catherine accepted the offered glass, her fingers trembling slightly. "On stormy nights when I was scared, Dad would play it to put me to sleep. Chopin, mostly. Nocturnes," Richard added. Eleanor played the same pieces for him. Flipping through more pages, Catherine found more recent photos. Maxwell older, alone at corporate events, Richard by his side at graduations and celebrations. James' absence was palpable, an emptiness that seemed to cry out from the glossy pages. "Why do you think he never came back?" Catherine asked suddenly. "After Mom died in the accident, when I was 15, he could have," Richard sighed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Pride, maybe, or fear. Sometimes, the more time passes, the harder it is to go back. Catherine closed the album, her hands caressing the leather cover. And now I'm here, a Harrison who grew up serving coffee instead of attending gala balls. You're more Harrison than you realize, Richard replied, a soft smile on his lips. You have the determination of Maxwell, the heart of Eleanor, and the courage of James to go your own way. Standing up, he walked over to one of the bookshelves and pulled out a folder. Tomorrow, the lawyers will come to discuss the details of the inheritance. But tonight, I'd like to show you something else. He held out the folder to Catherine. James' original plans for the coffee shop he never got around to opening. Catherine opened the folder with trembling hands, finding detailed drawings and notes in her father's handwriting. The name of the unrealized establishment made her eyes fill with tears. The Morning Brew. He never gave up on his dream, she murmured, realizing that her own cafe, unbeknownst to her, was the realization of her father's dream. He just passed it on to me. The morning brought with it a new reality for Catherine. Sitting in the library of the Harrison mansion, she watched three lawyers in impeccable suits present spreadsheets, graphs, and documents detailing her inheritance. At her side, Richard occasionally translated the complex legal terms into more accessible language. So, the lead attorney, Mr. Anderson, concluded after 2 hours of presentation, with the equal division determined by Mr. Harrison, your share corresponds to approximately $2.1 billion, including shares in Harrison Investments, properties in 5 states, and participation in various group companies. Catherine took a deep breath, her fingers drumming on the cup of coffee Mrs. Reynolds had brought, served on Limoges china, but still comforting in its familiarity. What if I don't want all this? She asked suddenly. The lawyers exchanged puzzled glances, but Richard leaned forward, interested. What do you mean? He asked softly. Don't get me wrong, Catherine continued, placing her cup on the coffee table. I'm grateful, more than you can imagine, but I don't need billions to be happy. Morning Brew is my life. Mr. Anderson sniffled, uncomfortably. Ms. Morrison, perhaps you don't understand the magnitude. No, I think she understands perfectly, Richard interrupted, a smile appearing on his lips. You have an idea in mind, don't you? Catherine nodded, getting up to walk over to one of the library's huge windows. Outside, the rose garden sparkled in the morning sun. I want to use some of the money to set up a foundation, she said, turning to face the room. The James and Eleanor Harrison Foundation, to help small business owners realize their dreams, like Dad wanted to realize his with the cafe. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Richard clapping his hands softly. Brilliant, he murmured. Absolutely brilliant. But, Mr. Anderson began. It's perfectly possible, Richard cut him off. We could structure the inheritance so that part goes to the foundation, keeping a smaller portion for Catherine personally. The spirit of the will would be maintained, just directed differently. The next few hours were spent redrafting the documents. Catherine insisted on keeping only a fraction of the fortune for herself, enough to expand Morning Brew and have security, as she explained. The rest would go to the foundation. When the lawyers finally left, Richard suggested lunch at the country club. I think it's time you got to know where it all began between your parents. The Cypress Hill Country Club retained the understated elegance of the 1990s, when James and Rachel first met. The main restaurant, with its glass walls offering spectacular views of the golf courses, was practically empty at that hour. Over there, Richard pointed to an elegant cafe in the corner of the main hall. That's where your mother worked. Catherine approached the marble counter, noticing the antique Italian coffee machine that still took pride of place. Its chrome lines, though vintage, were familiar to any barista. May I? She asked the current employee, who nodded curiously. With the ease of someone who has spent years preparing coffee, Catherine operated the machine. The familiar aroma filled the air, and for a moment, she could almost see her parents there. James, the rebellious young heir, enchanted by the barista who made coffee art with as much passion as he had for music. Perfect, Richard commented after tasting the cappuccino she had prepared, just like Rachel used to make. Mom always said that coffee isn't just a drink, it's a way of connecting. Catherine smiled, cleaning the machine with professional care. I think that's what attracted Dad. Not just the coffee, but the idea of creating something that would bring people together. And that's exactly what your foundation will do, Richard noted, connecting dreams to opportunities. After lunch, as they walked through the club's gardens, Catherine shared more of her plans. The foundation would not only offer startup capital, but also mentoring and ongoing support for small entrepreneurs. "I want to create a support network," she explained excitedly. "I envision training workshops, mentoring programs with experienced entrepreneurs, shared spaces for startups." Richard listened, amazed at how she naturally took on the role of leader, blending the Harrisons' entrepreneurial vision with the social sensitivity inherited from her parents. "You know," he commented when they stopped in front of a small lake, "Maxwell would be proud, not just for what you plan to do with the money, but for who you are." Catherine looked at her reflection in the water, seeing for the first time not only the girl from Dorchester, but also the granddaughter of Maxwell and Eleanor Harrison, the daughter of James and Rachel, a woman who could honor every aspect of her heritage. "I think I finally understand why Dad chose the path he did," she said softly. "It wasn't about rejecting the Harrison family, it was about finding your own way to make a difference." The week that followed was an intense immersion in the Harrison corporate world. Catherine, determined to understand every aspect of the empire she would help run through the foundation, spent her days in meetings with executives, visits to group companies, and long conversations with Richard about wealth management. One particularly hectic Thursday, after a board meeting where Catherine formally presented her proposal for the foundation, she met Richard on the terrace of Harrison Investments, 50 floors above Manhattan. "They loved you," Richard commented, offering her a glass of champagne, "especially when you countered Peterson's concerns about the social return on investment." Catherine smiled, remembering the look on the finance director's face when she presented a detailed social impact metrics plan. "I learned a few things running a cafe in Dorchester. Numbers are important, but people are more so." "Speaking of coffee," Richard began, hesitantly, "there's something I need to show you. Actually, it's a surprise I've been preparing." Intrigued, Catherine followed Richard to his car, where the driver was already waiting for them. During the drive through downtown Manhattan, she tried to extract more information, but Richard remained enigmatically silent. The car stopped in front of an elegant historic building on the Upper West Side. The red brick facade and large arched windows were reminiscent of early 20th century architecture. "This building," Richard explained as they climbed the steps to the entrance, "has belonged to the Harrisons for generations. Maxwell planned to turn it into yet another corporate office, but," he smiled, handing her an antique brass key, "I think you'll have a better idea for him." Catherine turned the key in the lock and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The space that was revealed was stunning. High ceilings, restored original columns, hardwood floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows, allowing natural light to flood the room. "Richard, this is the perfect headquarters for the James and Eleanor Harrison Foundation," he added. "And also," he guided her through the space to a specific area on the second floor, "the ideal location for the first branch of Morning Brew in Manhattan." Catherine turned slowly, absorbing every detail. The space was at least 3 times larger than her cafe in Dorchester, with a mezzanine that offered a perfect view of the bustling street below. "I found this in Maxwell's archives," Richard continued, handing him a folder. Inside were yellowed sketches, James' original plans for his dream cafe. The layout was surprisingly similar to the space they were in. "He had planned to open here," Catherine whispered, recognizing her father's handwriting in the marginal notes. This was the place he had chosen. "Maxwell bought the building around the same time," Richard revealed. "I think, deep down, he hoped that James would come back, that he would realize his dream here." Catherine walked over to one of the windows, her hands tracing the cold glass. Outside, New York pulsed with its characteristic energy. Inside, she could almost see the coffee tables occupied, the aroma of freshly roasted beans filling the air, people connecting over cups of cappuccino. "We could use the top floor for the foundation," she began to plan aloud. "Create a co-working space for the entrepreneurs we support. The cafe on the first floor would not only be a business, but a meeting place, a place for networking and informal mentoring." Richard watched, fascinated, as she walked around the space, gesturing and describing her vision. It was like seeing James again, with that same gleam of passion in his eyes. "There's one more thing," he said, guiding her to a particular corner of the room. There, partially covered by a tarpaulin, was a Steinway grand piano. "It was Eleanor's," he explained softly. "Maxwell kept it all these years. I thought it would be appropriate to have it here." Catherine sat down at the piano, her hands gliding gently over the keys. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne filled the space, echoing off the historic walls. "Music and coffee," she smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Just the way Daddy." Richard smiled. "The architects can start next week. I'm sure Peterson from finance will have a fit when he sees the renovation budget, but some things are worth more than money," Catherine added, getting up from the piano. "This is about building a legacy." The following months passed in a whirlwind of activity. Catherine divided her time between Boston and New York, personally overseeing the renovation of the Upper West Side building, while keeping the original Morning Brew running in Dorchester. Evenings were spent studying foundation management and strategic philanthropy, with Richard as her tireless mentor. One fall afternoon, exactly 6 months after her first visit to the Harrison mansion, Catherine was in the new space in Manhattan, overseeing the installation of the last pieces of furniture. The place had turned out exactly as she had imagined, a welcoming environment that blended classic elegance with modern touches. "Ms. Morrison?" The familiar voice called out from the doorway. It was Lucy, her longest-serving employee from the original Morning Brew, now manager of the Dorchester operation. "The first candidates for the mentoring program have arrived." Catherine straightened her blazer, a concession to the corporate world she now inhabited, and followed Lucy upstairs to the foundation's space. There, 20 young entrepreneurs were waiting, their eyes shining with the same hope she recognized from her own early days in the cafe. "Welcome to the James and Eleanor Harrison Foundation," she began, her voice firm but warm. "Each of you is here because you have a dream, just as my father did." As Catherine conducted the first orientation session, Richard watched discreetly from the doorway. It was impressive how she managed to connect with each person in the room, switching easily between discussions about business plans and conversations about personal challenges. After the meeting, when the last participant had left, Richard met Catherine on the balcony they had added to the project, her favorite place for reflection. "You'd be their pride," he commented, joining her in contemplating the sunset over Manhattan. "Maxwell, Eleanor, James, all of them." Catherine smiled, her fingers playing with the necklace she wore, a gift from Richard, containing the old key to the building. "Sometimes I wonder if they'd approve of all the changes we've made." "What changes would those be?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "Well, turning part of the Harrison empire into a foundation to support small business owners, opening the doors of the mansion for foundation events, using the Harrison name on a cafe." "Catherine," Richard interrupted her gently, "you didn't change the Harrison legacy, you expanded it. Maxwell built a financial empire, but you're building something just as valuable, opportunities for others to realize their dreams." At that moment, piano sounds began to float up from downstairs. It was time for the evening recital, a tradition Catherine had instituted by inviting local musicians to perform at the cafe. "Come on," she said, pulling Richard by the hand. "I want to show you something." On the first floor, the cafe was packed. Customers occupied the dark wooden tables, some working on laptops, others chatting quietly, all united by the music and the aroma of premium coffee. On the main wall, behind the Steinway piano where a young pianist was playing Debussy, Catherine had created a photo mural. "Our family history," she explained, pointing to the carefully arranged pictures. There were Maxwell and Eleanor at their wedding, James playing the piano, Rachel making coffee at the country club, Catherine as a child at the original Morning Brew, and finally, a recent photo. Catherine and Richard in the rose garden of the Harrison mansion. "We're all part of an ongoing story," she reflected. "Each generation adds its own chapter." Richard watched a young entrepreneur from the mentoring program passionately explaining her project to an investor at a nearby table. At another table, a group of music students discussed theory while sipping cappuccinos. "And what an incredible chapter you're writing," he replied. "You know, the other day I found some more of Maxwell's letters, written in the last months of his life, never sent." Catherine turned to him in surprise. What did they say? He wrote about regrets, about lost time, but also about hope. The last letter, Richard paused, moved. He wrote that perhaps true success lay not in the billions amassed, but in the ability to make a difference in the lives of others. Catherine felt tears well up in her eyes, just as Dad believed. And as you're proving every day, Richard added, gesturing to the space around them, this place is more than a cafe or a foundation. It's a testament to the fact that different visions of success can coexist and strengthen each other. Debussy's music floated through the air, mingling with the sound of conversations, the clinking of cups, and the gentle hum of coffee machines. It was a symphony of life, just as Catherine had dreamed. It was a spring morning in Greenwich, and the rose garden of the Harrison mansion was in full bloom. Catherine walked among the flowers, stopping occasionally to admire a particular variety or adjust a support. A year after the revelation that had changed her life, she had developed the same love for the garden as her grandmother Eleanor had. I thought I'd find you here, Richard's voice sounded behind her. The guests will start arriving in an hour. Catherine nodded, arranging one last Sterling's heart rose in her bouquet. It was a special day, the official inauguration of the Harrison Foundation Scholarship Program, which would be held at the mansion. But first, there was something important she needed to do. Will you come with me? She asked Richard, who immediately understood her destination. Together, they walked to the family's small private cemetery, where Maxwell and Eleanor lay side by side. Catherine carefully placed the bouquet between the headstones, its red petals contrasting with the white marble. A year ago, she began softly, I was just a girl from Dorchester trying to keep a cafe going. Now, she paused, moved. Now I understand that I'm part of something bigger, a story that began long before me. Richard put a comforting hand on her shoulder, and that will continue long after us. The sound of cars arriving at the mansion brought them back to the present. It was time to welcome the first beneficiaries of the scholarship program, 50 talented young people from low-income families who would receive a full university education through the foundation. In the mansion's library, transformed into an elegant function room, Catherine watched the young scholarship recipients and their families arrive. Each of them carried dreams as big as those her father had once had. Lucy, who now coordinated all of Morning Brew's operations, including the Manhattan branch, approached with a tray of coffee served in the Harrison's antique porcelain cups, a combination that perfectly symbolized the fusion of the two worlds. The figures for the last quarter are in, she said with a smile. The cafe in Manhattan is already generating enough profit to support 2 new foundation projects. Catherine smiled, proud. The model they had created was self-sustaining. The profits from the cafes fed the foundation's social programs, which in turn generated more opportunities and connections. Richard took to the small makeshift stage, signaling that it was time for the ceremony to begin. Catherine joined him, her heart racing at the sight of all those hopeful faces turned towards her. Welcome to Harrison Manor, she began, her voice firm and warm. Exactly 1 year ago, I discovered that being a Harrison meant more than a name or a fortune. It meant responsibility, vision, and, above all, the ability to transform lives. As she spoke, her words echoing through the historic library, Catherine noticed something extraordinary. The morning sun streaming through the stained glass windows created a pattern of light reminiscent of the roses in the garden. It was as if Eleanor was there, blessing this new chapter in the family history. Each one of you, she continued, represents the true legacy we want to build. It's not about buildings or bank accounts. It's about dreams realized, lives transformed, and the courage to follow your own path. After the ceremony, while the scholars and their families explored the mansion and gardens, Richard met Catherine again in the rose garden. She was standing in front of a new bed, white roses that she had planted herself. New varieties? He asked, noticing how the flowers stood out among the older ones. Hope's Promise, Catherine replied, gently touching a petal. Developed especially for the foundation, each scholar is taking a seedling home today. Richard smiled, understanding the symbolism. Planting seeds of hope. Just like Grandma used to do, Catherine added. You know, I spent so long wondering if I was honoring the Harrison legacy. Now I realize that the real legacy is not in what we keep the same, but in what we transform and make grow. From the terrace of the mansion came the sound of laughter and animated conversations. The scholars and their families were gathering for a lunch served outdoors, where the aroma of morning brew's gourmet coffee mingled with the fragrance of roses. "Maxwell used to say that fortune was power," Richard commented, observing the scene. "But you've shown that the real power lies in how we use that fortune to make a difference." Catherine smiled, thinking about how her life had changed in a year. From the little cafe in Dorchester to the Harrison mansion, she had found not only her inheritance, but her purpose. People often think that fairy tales end when the heroine discovers she's the heir to a fortune, she reflected. But actually, that's when the real story begins. A gentle breeze stirred the roses, spreading their scent across the garden. Somewhere, Catherine knew, her parents, grandparents, and all the Harrisons who came before were smiling, pleased to see that their legacy was in good hands. The sun was shining over Greenwich, promising a future as bright as the roses blooming in the Harrisons' garden. A future built on dreams, coffee, music, and, above all, the courage to turn an inheritance into something even greater.